In the name of the Almighty, I command thee, begone from this vessel. Relinquish thy hold, foul spirit.
The year was 1788, and a heavy fog clung to the cobbled streets of Bristol. It was a time when reason was beginning to challenge superstition. Yet the shadows of the old world remained long and dark. In the small community of Yatton, a terror had taken root that defied all medical explanation and whispered of ancient evil. The people spoke in hushed tones about a man named George Lukins, whose soul had seemingly become a battleground for unseen forces. The air itself felt thick with dread. As the rumors spread from the tavern corners to the holy sanctuaries of the church, this was not merely a tale of madness, but a confrontation with the abyss itself. George Lukins was once known as a simple man who worked as a tailor and a carrier in his village. He was well liked by his neighbors and was known for his devout attendance at the local parish services. There was nothing in his early life to suggest the darkness that would eventually consume him and terrorize those around him. He lived a quiet existence filled with the mundane tasks of needle and thread and the rhythm of rural life. However, the tranquility of his world was destined to be shattered by an event so strange that it would leave a mark on history. The darkness did not come with thunder, but with a strange silence that preceded the storm. The trouble began during a festive season when George Lukins was acting in a local Christmas pageant in the village. As he performed his role, he felt a sudden and violent blow to the side of his head that sent him reeling. When he looked around to see who had struck him, he found that there was no one there. The invisible assault left him disoriented and marked the beginning of a descent into a nightmare that would last for nearly 2 decades. It was a phantom strike that opened a door within his mind, or perhaps his soul, which could not easily be closed again. The locals began to look at him with a mixture of pity and growing fear. In the weeks that followed the invisible blow, George Lukins began to suffer from fits that were terrifying to behold. His body would contort into impossible shapes, and his limbs would thrash with a strength that betrayed his slender frame. Doctors from the surrounding areas were summoned to examine the tailor, but their potions and bleedings offered no relief. The medical men spoke of epilepsy and nervous disorders, yet none of their diagnoses could explain the malice that seemed to radiate from him during these episodes. The seizures were not random, but seemed to possess a dark intelligence that mocked the efforts of those trying to help him. The village of Yatton held its breath. As the years passed, the affliction of George Lukins grew more bizarre and deeply disturbing to the community. He began to make noises that were distinctly inhuman, including the barking of dogs and the hissing of serpents. Witnesses claimed that he would sing hymns in a reversed order or speak in languages that he had never learned. The pious man who once sat quietly in the pews was now a vessel of chaos who disrupted the sanctity of the church. His presence became a source of profound unease, and many began to cross the street to avoid passing near his home. The line between mental illness and spiritual corruption was blurring. George Lukins himself became convinced that he was not sick, but rather possessed by 7 distinct demons. He claimed that 7 devils had entered him and were fighting for control over his body and spirit. He told those who would listen that only 7 clergymen could drive them out and save his eternal soul. This specific number held a grim significance and added a ritualistic weight to his suffering that terrified the local population. The demons tormented him relentlessly and forced him to act in ways that were abhorrent to his Christian nature. He was a prisoner in his own flesh, trapped by occupants who desired his destruction. The torment became a spectacle that drew the attention of the learned and the religious alike throughout the county. George Lukins was often found wandering the fields screaming obscenities at the sky or convulsing in the mud. His physical appearance began to deteriorate as the strain of the internal battle took its toll on his health. His eyes, which were once kind and gentle now, held a wild and haunted look that chilled the blood of observers. He was a living warning of the fragility of the human spirit and the reality of the unseen war. The people of Yatton prayed for deliverance, but the shadows only deepened. Word of the Yatton Demoniac eventually reached the ears of the Reverend Joseph Easterbrook, who was the vicar of the Temple Church in Bristol. Easterbrook was a man of deep faith, but also a man of the Enlightenment who approached such tales with caution. He decided to investigate the claims personally and arranged to meet with the tormented tailor. What he encountered shook the foundations of his skepticism and forced him to confront a reality he had only read about in Scripture. The man he met was lucid one moment and a raving beast the next, displaying a duality that was terrifyingly real. Easterbrook knew he had to act. Reverend Easterbrook witnessed the fits firsthand and was particularly disturbed by the extreme physical contortions George Lukins endured. The tailor would gnash his teeth and foam at the mouth, while his body arched in agony. During these episodes, a voice that was not his own would spew hatred and blasphemy against the church and God. The vicar realized that traditional medicine had failed because the ailment was not of the body, but of the spirit. He felt a heavy burden of responsibility to help this poor soul who had been suffering for 18 long years. The time for observation was over. The vicar gathered a group of 6 other clergymen to assist him in what would be a dangerous undertaking. They were men of various denominations, including Methodists and Anglicans, united by the common goal of spiritual warfare. They agreed to meet at the Temple Church to perform a solemn prayer service and attempt to cast out the entities. This was not a decision made lightly, for they knew the dangers of engaging with demonic forces. The date was set for Friday, the 13th of June, in the year 1788. The significance of the date was not lost on anyone involved. On the morning of the exorcism, a crowd had gathered near the temple church, drawn by the spreading news of the event. The atmosphere was electric, with a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine fear among the spectators. George Lukins was brought to the church, but his demeanor was agitated, and he resisted entering the holy ground. It took the strength of several men to guide him through the heavy wooden doors and into the vestry. The air inside the church was cold and carried the scent of old stone and burning wax. The stage was set for a confrontation between light and absolute darkness. The 7 clergymen took their places around the trembling figure of George Lukins, who sat in a chair in the center. The light from the high windows filtered through the dust-creating beams that seemed to cut through the gloom. Reverend Easterbrook opened his Bible and began to read the prayers of deliverance with a steady voice. At first, the tailor sat quietly, but his hands gripped the arms of the chair with white-knuckled intensity. The tension in the room was palpable, as if the very air was waiting for a signal to erupt. Then the first low growl emanated from the throat of the possessed man. As the prayers intensified, the body of George Lukins began to shake, violently rattling the chair against the stone floor. His face twisted into a mask of pure malice that bore no resemblance to the man they knew. He let out a piercing scream that echoed off the vaulted ceiling and made the clergyman flinch. The demons within him seemed to wake from their slumber, agitated by the presence of the holy words. The battle had truly begun, and there was no turning back for the men of God. They stood their ground, holding their Bibles like shields against the onslaught. One of the demons identified itself with a voice that sounded like the cracking of dry bones. It mocked the clergymen, calling them fools and threatening to tear them limb from limb. George Lukins stood up, displaying a strength that was impossible for a man of his size and condition. He threw aside 2 strong men who tried to restrain him and paced the small circle like a caged predator. The vicars continued their chanting, raising their voices to be heard over the cacophony of insults. The room felt suffocatingly hot despite the chill of the stone walls. The entity claiming to be the leader of the 7 spoke in a guttural tone that vibrated in the chests of the witnesses. It claimed that it had tormented George Lukins for a generation and would not leave its home easily. The creature boasted of its power and laughed at the mention of faith and salvation. Reverend Easterbrook stepped forward and commanded the spirit to be silent in the name of the Father. The reaction was immediate as Lukins fell to his knees, clutching his head as if in severe pain. The power of the name was effective, but the war was far from won. Suddenly, the behavior of George Lukins shifted, and he began to mimic the sounds of various animals in rapid succession. He barked like a rabid dog and hissed like a viper, ready to strike at the priests. This display was intended to confuse and terrify the men, but they remained steadfast in their purpose. They sang hymns with fervor, and their combined voices created a wall of sound against the madness. The tailor writhed on the floor, his body forming a grotesque arch that seemed to defy anatomy. The physical toll on him was immense, yet he showed no sign of fatigue. The clergymen took turns reading from the scriptures, ensuring that the barrage of holy words never ceased for a moment. They knew that silence would give the entities a chance to regroup and launch a counterattack. George Lukins, or the thing controlling him, began to speak in Latin, a language the uneducated tailor did not know. He taunted the priests with theological arguments and twisted interpretations of the Bible. This intellectual assault was more chilling than the physical violence, for it showed a dark and ancient intelligence. The room seemed to darken as the afternoon wore on. At the height of the frenzy, the possessed man turned his eyes toward Reverend Easterbrook and whispered a chilling prophecy. He spoke of doom and suffering for those who dared to oppose the legion within him. But Easterbrook did not waver, and instead pressed a Bible against the forehead of the struggling man. George Lukins recoiled as if burned by a hot iron and let out a shriek that curdled the blood. The demons were suffering under the weight of the scripture, and their hold was beginning to slip. The clergymen sensed the shift and redoubled their efforts. The battle raged on for hours, with the priests exhausted and sweating in their heavy vestments. They called upon the Holy Trinity, repeatedly demanding the departure of the seven spirits. George Lukins was now weeping, but the tears were not his own. They were tears of rage from the entities. The internal struggle was visible on his face as his features shifted between the human George and the demonic mask. It was a war of attrition, and the human vessel was breaking under the strain. The air in the vestry smelled of ozone and sulfur. Finally, the clergymen commanded the demons to reveal their names and depart to the abyss where they belonged. The voice that answered was a chorus of discordant tones speaking in unison. They refused to leave claiming ownership of the soul they had inhabited for so long. The priests did not falter and invoked the name of Jesus with a thunderous shout. The reaction was catastrophic as George Lukins was lifted from the floor and thrown back down with tremendous force. The stone floor cracked under the impact, but the man did not rise immediately. Silence fell over the room for the first time since the exorcism had begun, and the dust motes danced in the light. The clergymen waited with bated breath, unsure if the man was dead or if the spirits were playing a trick. Slowly, George Lukins began to move his limbs, unfolding from the crumpled heap on the floor. He looked up at Reverend Easterbrook, and his eyes were clear and filled with tears of relief. The wild look was gone, replaced by the confusion of a man waking from a long nightmare. He whispered a praise to God. The demons had fled, leaving behind a man who was exhausted and battered, but finally free of their influence. George Lukins stood up on shaky legs and embraced the clergyman who had fought for his soul. He recited the Lord's Prayer without stumbling or hesitation, something he had been unable to do for years. The sound of his clear voice reciting the holy words was the sweetest victory for the weary priests. The atmosphere in the church lightened, as if a heavy shroud had been lifted from the sanctuary. The ordeal was over. News of the successful exorcism spread quickly through Bristol and the surrounding villages, including Yatton. George Lukins became a minor celebrity, and people flocked to see the man who had been delivered from 7 devils. However, not everyone believed the account, and skepticism began to rise in the intellectual circles. Critics claimed that Lukins was a fraud or a madman who had been manipulated by the clergy. Pamphlets were published mocking the event and accusing the church of promoting medieval superstitions. The debate raged in the newspapers and coffee houses. Despite the controversy, George Lukins returned to his life in Yatton, a changed man. He resumed his work as a tailor and attended church regularly with a newfound devotion. He lived for many years after the exorcism and never again displayed the signs of possession. To those who knew him before and after the change was nothing short of miraculous. He walked the streets of his village without fear, and the neighbors no longer crossed the road to avoid him. He was a living testament to the power of faith. Yet there were those who whispered that the darkness had not truly left, but had merely gone into hiding. Some claimed that on quiet nights near the temple church, one could still hear the faint sound of barking and hissing. The skepticism of the age tried to bury the event under the guise of reason, but the story persisted. It became a legend that was passed down through generations, a warning that the veil between worlds is thin. The mystery of what truly happened inside that church remains a subject of debate to this day. The medical community of the time tried to explain the case of George Lukins as a severe form of hysteria or epilepsy. They argued that the intricate performance of the demons was a manifestation of a fractured psyche seeking attention, but they could not explain the physical strength or the knowledge of languages the tailor possessed. The scientific explanations fell short of capturing the sheer terror and the palpable presence of evil described by the witnesses. Science had its limits, and on that day in June, they had been reached. Reverend Easterbrook stood by his account of the events until his dying day, refusing to recant a single detail. He believed that he had looked into the face of the enemy and had emerged victorious through the grace of God. His writings on the subject became a cornerstone for those who studied spiritual warfare in the following century. He faced ridicule from his peers, but found solace in the peace he had brought to George Lukins. For him, the truth was self-evident in the liberated life of the tailor. The story of the Yatton Demoniac serves as a grim reminder of the fears that lurked beneath the surface of the 18th century. It was a time when the light of the Enlightenment was bright, but the shadows it cast were deep and terrifying. The case of George Lukins straddled the line between the old world of magic and the new world of science. It challenged the comfortable assumptions of society and forced them to look at the darkness within. It remains one of the most well-documented cases of exorcism in British history. As the years turned into decades, the details of the exorcism began to fade into folklore and legend. The temple church itself was eventually bombed during the Second World War, leaving only a shell of the building where the battle took place. The ruins stand today as a silent monument to the history of Bristol and the secrets it holds. Walking through the Leaning Tower and the hollow walls, one can almost feel the echoes of the past. The ground remembers the struggle that took place there. George Lukins died in peace years later and was buried in the churchyard of his home village of Yatton. His grave became a place of interest for those fascinated by the macabre and the supernatural. Visitors would leave small tokens or say prayers for the man who had endured so much suffering. His life was a journey through hell and back, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. But even in death, his name invokes a sense of unease. The psychological toll on the 7 clergymen who performed the ritual was never fully documented, but must have been immense. To engage with such darkness leaves a mark on the soul that time cannot easily erase. They carried the memory of those voices and those eyes with them for the rest of their lives. They were soldiers in a spiritual war who had seen the enemy up close and survived. Their courage is a quiet footnote in the history of the church. In the modern era, we look back at the case of George Lukins with a mixture of skepticism and fascination. We try to diagnose him with modern terms like schizophrenia or dissociative identity disorder. We strip away the supernatural elements to make the story fit our understanding of the world. But deep down there is a part of us that wonders if the old stories might be true. We wonder if there are forces out there that science cannot measure or control. The enduring legacy of the Yateley Exorcism title, often confused with Yatton, serves to keep the story alive in search engines and archives. It reminds us that names and places may get muddled, but the essence of the horror remains the same. Whether in Yateley or Yat, the fear of the unknown is a universal human experience. The story of George Lukins taps into our primal fear of losing control of our own minds. It is a mirror reflecting our deepest anxieties. As night falls over the ruins of the Temple Church in Bristol, the shadows seem to lengthen and twist. The city noise fades into the background, and the atmosphere becomes heavy with memory. If you listen closely, you might hear the wind whispering through the stones, carrying the faint echo of a hymn. It is a place where the barrier between the past and present feels dangerously thin. The ghosts of 1788 are never far away. The tale of George Lukins ends not with a grand explosion, but with the quiet resumption of a life interrupted. It is the silence after the scream that is most profound and perhaps most unsettling. The evil was banished, but the knowledge of its existence could not be unlearned by those who witnessed it. They lived in a world that was suddenly larger and more frightening than they had imagined. The demons were gone, but the door they used remained ajar. We are left to ponder the nature of evil and whether it resides within us or invades from without. George Lukins believed he was a vessel for external forces, and his liberation proved it to his satisfaction. The skeptics believed the demons were of his own making, born of a troubled mind. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the gray space between faith and madness. It is in that gray space that the most terrifying stories are born. The exorcism of 1788 stands as a testament to the power of belief to shape reality, whether the demons were real or imagined. The cure required a ritual of immense faith and conviction. The drama played out in that vestry was a battle of wills that transcended the physical realm. It showed that the human mind is capable of creating its own hell and perhaps its own heaven. The power to heal and the power to destroy lie within. So when you walk through the fog of a cold English evening and hear a strange noise in the dark, remember George Lukins. Remember the man who carried 7 devils and the men who fought to set him free. Remember that the world is full of mysteries that defy explanation and shadows that hold secrets. Tread carefully, for you never know what might be watching from the gloom. The past is never truly dead. The final question that lingers is not whether George Lukins was possessed, but what became of the entities that were cast out. Did they return to the abyss, or did they find new homes in the unsuspecting crowd? Evil does not die, it merely changes form and waits for a new opportunity. The story of the exorcism is a closed chapter, but the book of darkness is never finished. Somewhere in the dark, the 7 are still waiting. As you turn off your screen and return to the safety of your lighted room, let the story of the Yatton Demoniac settle in your mind. Let the unease creep up your spine, and the shadows in the corner of your eye take shape. The barrier between you and the unseen world is as fragile as a heartbeat, and in the silence of the night, you might just hear a whisper that is not your own. Sleep well,